introduction. Welcome to the audience. I'm glad to speak in front of you. I am co-owner of DRNW and the team leader of the Windows security and the audit team. And we will talk about an exciting topic.
Could you switch on the microphone?
Oh, yes. It's better? Oh, thank you. Sorry. Now it's better. Yes, thank you. So welcome again. This will be our agenda, and as Sergey said in his keynote today, we will have to switch on the dark side first. So don't wonder if you might feel as if you would be in a hacker session at least for the first 30 minutes. So, do you think you are protected? I know, bad question. But I put them anyway. Look at this. Many of you have this. Firewall, intrusion detection, anti-spam, web security. You have a number of incidents per day. Look at the antivirus, what they hit. 4,500 infections per month. You do a lot of security, don't you? It's good. I think it is. Do you think one of your systems in Active Directory might be compromised? Against pass the hash, pass the Kerberos, or some pass the dollar ticket? Do you know about golden tickets? Who knows about golden tickets? Okay, so already some. So welcome, and we will see. Imagine an attacker that is a kind of T-1000 model from Terminator 2. He's of liquid metal. He has the ability to impersonate each person he wants to impersonate. Let's have a look. It's intended without audio. So he's going to impersonate. He's going bypassing security control. He might appear a clean man. He might appear an administrator. He might appear the boss. Whoever he wants to look like, he might appear. Is this the future? No, it already happened. And I don't want to make you afraid, but probably as well in your enterprise. Do you see any link to your Active Directory infrastructure? Probably you might. So welcome again. This is a copy of a slide from Microsoft talk at TechEd, and you see here how pass the hash attacks are working. It begins with an infected workstation, and then the attacker harvests credentials and moves from one workstation to another. Eventually, he gets credentials from a server, then he moves to a server. Eventually, he gets credentials from a domain controller. Then he owns the domain controller, and he owns the domain. This is a very interesting report. Probably you know. It's the data breach investigation report of Verizon. You see how the hacking has has increased. And if you have a look at the use of stolen credentials, it's on the top. It wasn't on the top all the years, but it has been on top now, and probably it will be going to be on top. So it's really an important threat that should be addressed somehow. How do you communicate this to your management? Another big question, we will come later to this. And now we are starting with Windows authentication. We will do now a deep dive. That's not possible in 1 hour. A dive in Windows authentication, in the Windows authentication framework, in some components like the ELSAS process, which is one of the important subsystems of Windows. You see it here. You see different authentication packages, Kerberos, MSV1, and other, that contain, in a protected mode, credentials of users. And you see here, schematically, the possibilities to either authenticate against the SAM, a local account, or the Active Directory. LSA, the LSA process, of course, contains a lot of security mechanisms. The credentials are not stored in an encrypted manner. Of course, they are stored encrypted, but they are stored encrypted in a symmetrically way, and the keys have to lie in the memory. Perhaps they don't have, but in current operating systems, they normally lay in the memory. And of particular interest for the attacker are the password hashes, encryption keys, and Kerberos tickets. So let's have a look at Windows authentication, more precisely at local NTLM authentication. It's a challenge response procedure, as you know, and the administrator enters his password, his name, and you see here the authentication package in the ELSAS process, which contains 2 versions of the hash. The hash is validated against the security account manager database when the user authenticates locally. In Kerberos, it's a little bit more complicated. Kerberos provides mutual authentication for clients and server, is used to access remote system. In the Kerberos terminology, you have you have 3 important components. One is the key distribution center, that is the domain controller in Microsoft's implementation. You have a client computer or user, and you have the service or the server, which is assessed by the client. There are 3 different encryption keys which are important and authentication services provided by Kerberos. We should be, in order to understand the attack, familiar with these 3 kinds of keys. They are the long-term key of the domain controller of the domain, which is the Kerb TGT account, and his secret is very important. His secret signs the so-called PAC. I will come later to this. Then we have the client long-term key, that is the NTLM hash or the Kerberos ticket of a computer or a user. And finally, we have the service or server hash O ticket, which is used by the server or service which is accessed by the user. A very important data structure within a Kerberos ticket is the PAC. The PAC is the privileged authentication, privileged account certificate. The privileged account certificate contains the information of the user's rights in Active Directory. It contains information about his group memberships, his privileges, and some information about map drive and home path and so on. But the important information is the identity of the user and his group memberships and security privilege on the system he wants to access, or in Active Directory. This PAC is signed with the long-term key of the domain controller, that is the NTLM hash of the Kerb-TGT account. We will have a short overview about Kerberos Authentication, how it works. You see a user, the user enters his password, and then now, again in the ELSAS process, but now in the Kerberos DLL, you find authenticators, and these authenticators are representatives of the password in different encrypted formats. Now, the authentication process works like this. The user wants authenticate to the domain controller, so he does an authentication service request to the domain controller. And the domain controller verifies the password that the user entered and that was converted in these authenticators against his Active Directory database. That is the NTDS-DIT, which is stored on the domain controller. If it is right, and we are assuming this, the domain controller issues a TGT, that is a ticket granting ticket, to the client. And the client then wants, we assume this, wants to access a resource, for example, a file server. With the TGT, he can't access a file server. Therefore, he needs a TGS, a ticket granting service ticket. And here you see the client represents the TGT that he has received from the domain controller to the service, and then he gets access to the service. So the domain controller never speaks with the server or with the service. The client receives a kind of bill in order to authenticate himself, and with this bill he is entitled to request service tickets in order to authenticate against services. We may draw two important conclusions from this. One is, which is the trust anchor in Active Directory? This is one, and we already saw that there were some keys and hashes involved. The second important question is, where are they stored? They are stored in the ELSAS process, but in which format, and might they be accessible in some way? To answer the first question, this point is very important, that you understand this. The trust anchor the central trust anchor, a kind of stamping authority for the domain, is the Kerb-TGT account of this domain. And what's it? It's an NTLM hash. So that's the trust anchor of your domain. And it's a trust anchor. If you have a forest, then of course you have for each domain, you have a Kerb-TGT account. But the whole security relies on this trust anchor. This is important to understand. Then, another thing that is very interesting. It's not very necessary. It's not so important to understand it, but it's interesting. The source is Benjamin Delpy. Benjamin Delpy is the author of the famous Mimikatz tool that we will see as well. He did this work, and he listed which accounts are accessible, let me say with his tool, but as well with other tools, which account passwords, which credentials are accessible in which Windows version, depending if it's a local account or domain account. So we have bad news. The bad news are, if you look at, I don't even want to speak about Windows Server 2003. Windows XP, we know, is out of support. Windows Server 2003 will be. But assuming your enterprise runs this, you see there's nearly all red. And all red is that credentials, hashes, Kerberos keys, encryption keys are accessible to hacker tools as Mimikatz. If you look at Windows 8 and 2012 environment, it's still very much things are red. It becomes a little bit better if you look at new versions or current versions of Windows, Windows 8.1 and Server 2012 R2. One important remark: don't think you are better protected if you use smart cards or biometrics. Look at this. It's all red. The representatives, the hash that is generated for a smart card user, or the hash that is generated for a user that uses biometric device, is even more accessible, let me say in this way, is more accessible in memory than if you won't have used this. So keep this in memory as well. One word on Linux systems that are Kerberized and part of an Active Directory. It's not unusual, and I think each large enterprise has Linux and Unix systems that are part of the Active Directory. There it's even worse. This is one example. The Kerberos ticket is accessible by each user. It's not necessary that's an administrator or that it's root. Administrator or root, the root account has access to each Kerberos ticket. In Windows, users cannot export their tickets by default. And administrators as well, it's not so, they might with some tools, but by default, they even might not export their Kerberos ticket. So keep an eye on these machines, which are often overlooked. Now that we have the basis to understand how these attacks work, let us have a look at credential theft and credential reuse in Active Directory. What is pass the hash? You see here at the graphic, that's the normal procedure. The user enters his password and the hash is generated and verified by an instance. In case of local authentication, by the local computer or standalone system. If an attacker was able to get the hash of the user, then for the attacker, it's not necessary to even break the password or to know the password. He simply injects the hash of the user in the LSAS process of the machine, and then he impersonates the user from whom he has the hash. Pass the ticket is technically a little bit more sophisticated, but it's basically the same thing. It's a reuse of Kerberos tickets to receive service ticket or access Kerberos service directly. If we assume that an attacker was able to get the TGT, then he is able to impersonate the user. He will do this, we will see this, with a different kind of tools. It's possible. He injects the ticket in the LSAS process, and then he appears to the domain controller as if he were the user himself. So it's no more necessary to get a ticket from the domain controller because he already has stolen it. Then, with this ticket granting ticket, the attacker authenticates to the domain controller, and he will receive the service tickets that are available for this user he is impersonating, and then he accesses the resource. A bit more limited is pass the service ticket, because it refers only to one resource, but it works basically the same way. You see, impersonating a valid user account, it's no more necessary to ask the KDC for authentication, neither to request a service ticket because he already has it, and then he can access the resource. Kerberos tickets might be passed via Mimikatz, and Kerberos tickets might be exported via Mimikatz in order to be used on another system. It's not necessary that the attacker, once he harvested the credentials, that he accesses the domain from a domain computer. He is able to export the tickets and use it from everywhere he wants. Network connectivity supposed. So, on the first step, from the attacker's perspective, we may summarize as follows. There are different ways to obtain hashes and Kerberos tickets, ticket granting tickets as well as service tickets, and ticket granting ticket allows full impersonation of a user within the valid time of the ticket granting ticket, that is by default 10 hours. With a service ticket, the access is restricted to the resource for which the service ticket is valid, and it's as well 10 hours. It's the validity of a service ticket. So we see from an attacker's perspective, we have some limitations, don't we have? We have only a ticket granting ticket of a certain user. This user probably is not the domain administrator, isn't it? Perhaps it's another one. So I think it would be more interesting for an attacker to create his own ticket. And that's what we are going to do and what we are talking about. Self-made Kerberos tickets. I refer to a conference from Benjamin Delpy, where he said, and I like this, he said, they were made with a lot of love. You can imagine, as his tool was written and compiled with a lot of love and with a lot of capabilities. The golden ticket is a kind of T1000 model we saw in the introduction. It allows you to do practically everything in Active Directory. And it is not made by the domain controller, but it has a very important, as you may assume, it has a very important requirement. That is, you need, for the creation of a golden ticket, you need to hack a domain controller. Okay, that's need to be clear. That you can't create a golden ticket for a domain without having the NTLM hash of the Kerb TGT account. But from an attacker's perspective, I may tell you that in 7, 8 years Windows or Active Directory pen testing, we always achieved to compromise the domain controller. But some years ago, there wasn't the tools, we haven't the tools to create a golden ticket. So the threat was not as big as it is now. Remember, the Kerb TGT account is the primary trust anchor of the domain, and this account doesn't change his password normally. Any user account, any computer account that are far less privileged in Active Directory need to change their password according to the policy, or the default domain policy, or the policy that is valid for computer accounts, which is 30 days by default. But one account, and precisely the most important account, doesn't have to change his password. He only changes his password when the domain is upgraded from 2003 to 2008 or higher. And it is changed as well if you do an authoritative restore of Active Directory. Everyone did this? No. So probably you already have the same key. And another important information, the previous Kerb TGT is valid as well. So even if you come from 2003, probably your Kerb TGT account, if compromised, might be used for a golden ticket.
Unless you restore.
Yes. So here are the prerequisites for creating a golden ticket. As I said, you need the NTLM hash of the Kerb TGT account, which you see here. you need the domain SID and the domain name. But if you got this, you already have this as well. With a golden ticket, your capabilities in Active Directory are nearly unlimited. You are able, because you are the stamping authority now, and you are able to create tickets for existing users. You are able to create tickets for users and extend their capabilities. You are even even able to create non-existing user accounts in the domain. You are even able to impersonate disabled user accounts. So there are basically no restrictions. From an attacker's perspective, be creative. Yes. We will have a little demo, and I like this one. I don't always use Kerberos, but when I do, I create golden tickets. That's from Benjamin Delpli, therefore, thanks to him. And now we will see a little demo. We will create a golden ticket, and we will use it. So this is Hyper-V, and we have here some virtual machines. We have the domain controller that is running. You see him here. We have the attacker machine, which is even not member of the domain. It's not necessary in order to perform this attack. And we have another machine running. Here you see the attacker's machine, and I will have a look. I will have a look at user account control enabled. That's good. Now you see who am I. That's not important because I'm on the attacker machine, and on the attacker machine, of course, I will need administrative privileges. I will have a look at my Kerberos. If I have some Kerberos tickets stored, this is like this, and you see there are no cached tickets. Now, in order to prove which privileges I have without a golden ticket and without being a member of Active Directory, neither the computer nor the user, I will try to access the admin share on the domain controller. And you might, it's very clear what will be result. I will be prompted for the username. Of course, everything works as designed. Now, I have mimicards on the attacker machine. And now I create a golden ticket. And here, that's an important information. You see the ID I give them the administrator ID, the golden ticket, and group membership of domain admins, of enterprise admins, and of built-in administrators of the Active Directory, of the domain that I'm attacking. So now you see PAC generated, PAC signed with the Kerb TGT account, that we have. Encryption ticket pack generated, encryption ticket part encrypted, and the Kerb credentials created. We have saved this in a file, and this file is stored in the directory here you see where Mimikatz works. So now we have to inject this ticket in the ELSAS process, and this works with that command. Now I will do a k-list. No, I will do this in the syntax of Mimikatz. And you see, here you see, I have a TGT, and that's good. Here you see, the validity of the TGT is not 10 hours, it's 10 years. So once I have this ticket and once I'm not detected, I would be able to use this ticket for a very long time. Now I will try to assess again. I have the ticket here as well, I see it, and then I do this. You see, I mounted, I have access to the administrative share of the domain controller. Now I have installed on this machine that is not part of Active Directory, the Active Directory users in computers. And now you see, I don't like this administrator. I go in his account. I change this because that's not good. So here you see, it's only one example. Yes, one example that demonstrates that I'm capable to modify the creator of the Active Directory. Yes, I could give a lot more, but I won't now. So we will continue. We will change to the white side now. And now, what to do? Mitigations. You may assume that in the short time I will be only able to give a short overview. So, tough decisions ahead. I will do it in two versions. One version for the management and a little bit more comprehensive version. The version for the management is actually a two-slider. But I think it contains the important message. What should be done? We should reorganize the administrative practice and management of Active Directory and business critical services within Active Directory. We should accompany this with some, they are not much, but some specific pass the hash and pass the ticket mitigations. And of course, we should do a good Active Directory security logging and monitoring, what many companies don't have. So, the good news are, this will not require spending a lot of money in fancy tools, fancy appliances, and so on. That's the good news. But provided this is would be a kind of management information, don't forget the small print, which is you will probably need more administrative and operational resources. That's it. management will understand this. Probably at least the second slide. So don't forget the small print. Remember what Harun said in the keynote yesterday about the information asymmetry between the personnel usually working in the InfoSec area and the management. Easy task. You are done. Okay, so the little bit more comprehensive version for us probably. This is a very high-level overview, and I will speak about, from my perspective, the most important topics only in a short way. We may classify these high-level steps as follows. I don't will talk about the preconditions, but they really are preconditions. Know your asset, have processes, patch management, and so on in place, okay? Then, what's very important, design and implement administration model and tiers. You see, there are two mitigations that are great. There's one reason. I will come later on to this. I don't think that there are, there might be important from Microsoft's point of view, they are. From my point of view, not so much. And then, apart from these design and organizational controls, you will have, of course, a lot of technical controls. We will do a walkthrough to these mitigations. The very most important mitigation is the design and the implementation of an administrative model with tiers. You see this here, you might presume 3 tiers, one with domain controllers, very simple, one with servers and one with workstations. And you should mix never the Active Directory, your internal forest, with the DMZ forest. Keep them separated. So, how this model works. You see it here. In each tier, you have own administrative or high privileged accounts. It's not only it's not only a model for administrative tiers, it's a model for, if you speak in a broader way, it's a model for credential partitioning. Yes? And you should have, in each tier, should have his own administrative personnel with own administrative workstations. That might be hardened jump servers, it might be Hyper-Vs, but it should be dedicated machines. And these administrative personnel with high privileged accounts should never log on to lower privileged resources. And I will go through this in more detail, how this model works. First of all, each administrative or each privileged resource has to be classified as to belonging only to one tier. Personnel that has responsibilities on different tiers, if you have admins that administer the Active Directory, the domain controllers, and if you have admins that as well administer workstations and member servers, they must have different accounts. That's not so unusual, yes? Then account that currently logs onto multiple tiers must be split into multiple accounts. This is very important for service accounts. If you have an agent running on each machine with a domain admin privilege, that's bad, of course. It would be better if it's an account that only provides service for domain controllers and servers. And it would really be better if it was separated in a third tier as well, that you have service accounts that are working only in one tier. And of course, these accounts all must have different passwords. Administrative accounts may not control higher resources and lower as well. We already had this. And if it's, for example, necessary that a domain admin administers accounts of servers or server administrators, he should use tools that do not expose their credentials in the LSAS process. So we are coming a little bit to the technical side. It's not a mere organizational task to implement these tiers. You have to accompany them with some technical configurations. And one of them is this, for example, use MMC consoles. MMC consoles don't expose the credentials. Don't use PowerShell script in a certain configuration. They will expose credentials. Don't use remote desktop on another tier. It will expose credentials. Of course, limit the number of administrative accounts. In the highest tier, the schema admins should have members only on demand, clearly. Limit the number of hosts on which administrative credentials are exposed, and limit the roles which require more privileges to the privilege they really need. Then there are another things to remember. Administrative accounts shouldn't be granted the debug privilege because the debug privilege allows to look in another process. The administrators have it by default. So keep an eye on this. Restrict, and now another very important control, restrict and protect local accounts. That is, account of SAM databases on member computers. Microsoft now recommends that you even don't use these accounts. This is quite difficult to achieve, but you might protect them in some way. You might enforce local account restrictions for remote access. For example, you might deny network logon. There are several kinds of logon types, and for example, network logon should be denied for local accounts. And of course, there should be a management solution for high privileged local accounts. Some very large enterprises do have this, but not all. A very simple proposal might look like this. A simple proposal that I can give here, but that might be adopted from you. You have one tier for DCs, one tier for servers, and business critical applications with at least these 3 compartments within the tier. And finally, you have desktop or laptops. Of course, it would be good if you have some compartmentalization within the tier. I think you already understood what are the benefits of this this mitigation, I think in reality we don't have any alternative, because if you don't expose your credentials, simply an attacker won't be able to harvest it, right? So this leads to a comment that I liked very much, that Harun said in his keynote yesterday. Don't build it by your own. Build your, in this case, administrative tier model by your own. Don't buy it. But we are still not done. I will spend some words on ISA-E Forest. That's a recommendation from Microsoft. That's from an architectural and design perspective very interesting. You don't expose the administrative accounts because the administrative accounts of the production domain are members in a trusted forest in an administrative environment. So here you find these credentials, but that's good, yes, and that enhances security. But remember what we said, the most important trust anchor of Active Directory is the Kerb-TGT account. And this trust anchor is not protected by the enhanced forest. So even from a design perspective, we might question whether this model is a good one or not. I tend, it depends a little bit on your administrative praxis. It adds an additional security layer, but it doesn't provide a solution for the core problem. So what about some other high-level controls? I only mentioned the most important one, and I will mix now all the members in the domain. Have OS and application software up to date. I won't speak about passwords. I already did it. You know it, and so on. Have a special look at service accounts. We will come later to this one slide later. Have UAC enabled, at least at defaults. Have DEP enabled and EMET deployed, at least on clients and on DCs and on IIS web servers as well. Have a look on additional NTFS permissions and implement restricted groups for privileged accounts and don't give the admins the debug privilege. About service accounts, there would be a lot to say. I leave it to this very good paper, which is a kind of must-read for Active Directory administrators and Active Directory security. Last but not least, some words in order to mitigate pass the hash, pass the ticket, golden ticket attacks. There's not so much to do extra. If you implement the mitigations I mentioned, especially the administrative tier model, you already did a lot. Do the stuff, so I already mentioned, Orga and Technique. Now that's new. Reset the Kerb-TGT account on a regular basis. There is, since 2 weeks, a script available from Microsoft. There should not be so many complications. On the floor, we may talk about this if you want it. We don't have time now to do this. And, of course, do Active Directory security monitoring, which would be an extra topic and could be filled hours. So, unfortunately, I can't do this. But finally, what we will provide together with the slides, we did a kind of overall evaluations of mitigations. I think this is very useful because you see here the mitigation, for example, admin tiering, credential partitioning. You have some details. Of course, you couldn't have all. Then you have the security benefit on a scale from excellent to very low. You have the operational feasibility of this mitigation. And then, as well on a scale from excellent to very low. And then you have attributes to each mitigation. Mitigates credential theft, yes or no. Mitigates credential use. Mitigates privilege escalation. Mitigates lateral movement. And here, effectiveness against mimikatz. It's quite long. It's only a screenshot from the Excel. You will see that there are nearly no mitigations against mimikatz. Facilitates security monitoring, the control, and from our perspective of view, a must-have or a recommended. And I think with this slide, you will get some valuable information in order to design your appropriate security controls. So this was a very quick and fast overview. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Friedwart. I think we have like 5 minutes Q&A.
Yes, please.
10 years ago, Microsoft used to recommend a separate trusted root domain. This seems to be heading back to that because you end up with that top tier of very isolated domain controllers, very small number of domain controllers with a really controlled ticket granting authority in the top.
Yes, they did with Server 2003. It was possible to create forest trusts. And we actually at this time recommended at very large organization to do this, to put their admin accounts in this domain. But the important thing with relationship to the KERB-TGT account, it doesn't add a layer of protection for this account. It adds a layer of protection for the administrative accounts.
One more question.
You say that we have to monitor the DC, the system, so to keep an eye on the log files. I know it was not covered because it's a huge subject, but do you have some recommendation? So the event viewer is really verbose, so we have plenty of events.
Yes.
If you had to monitor specific events to detect attacks like this, do you have some events ID?
Okay, I will say only a very few words to this because it's quite complicated. The short version is pass the hash and pass the ticket attacks are very, very difficult to detect because they are malware free. The user or the attacker uses legal credentials. The only thing we might be able is a kind of anomaly detection. You have to know how your administrators work. You have to know, for example, at what time they normally work.
On Sunday afternoon, for example.
This might be an attack. This might be an indicator. It must be not, as you know, as well, but it might be. And but if you, for example, define log-on types, for example, administrative accounts shouldn't log on lower resources, and if you prohibit, for example, remote desktop, and if then comes a service account with a remote desktop connection, then this might be quite suspicious. So there are some possibilities to monitor this. But if if it's a targeted attack or if the attacker knows how your administrators works, it's nearly impossible.
Thanks. There was another question.
It's related to this.
And one comment. Oh, okay. And that's actually the last.
Yeah, quick comment. MSID 522 is an awesome way to find past the hash.
522?
522.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks again, Friedwart.
Thank you.